most people know that for centuries, having dwarfism meant you were likely to live a hard life. But what if you were a royal with dwarfism? Did that make things better or worse? Unfortunately, it made things much worse. And in some cases, it meant that your entire life would be spent in obscurity, hidden away from the world. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're exploring the strange and hidden history of royal children born with dwarfism. Make sure to watch until the end because the story only gets crazier as time goes on. Let's get started. Now, when we say royal, we don't mean just any king or queen, but specifically the most powerful and prominent families in Europe during the Middle Ages and early modern period. We're talking about the Spanish, Habsburgs, the French and Russian monarchies, and lesser known but extremely wealthy families like the Italian Gonzagas. These folks were obscenely wealthy and powerful. So you might be wondering, if they had all the money and influence in the world, why didn't they just take care of their dwarfish children? Well, it all comes down to one thing: the belief that dwarfism was a curse, or at least a really bad omen. You see, the Catholic Church held a very low view of dwarfism, believing that it was the result of an unlawful carnal act committed by parents before or during childbirth. For example, the Spanish Habsburgs had a particular problem with this, since their family tree had more than its fair share of intermarriage. You know, that's actually a real thing. Intermarriage is when two people who are related marry each other, and it's a lot more common than you think. This is especially true among royalty, since they want to keep their wealth and power within their bloodline. But as you can imagine, marrying your cousins and uncles to your nieces can lead to some serious health problems. But hey, at least this gave rise to some of the most famous paintings of all time, like this one of the Spanish royal family. Can you name that artist? Right, good job. Anyway, back to dwarfism. While today we understand that dwarfism is caused by genetic factors and has nothing to do with how your parents have relations, the lack of scientific understanding in the past led to all sorts of wild beliefs. So if dwarfism was seen as something shameful and unnatural, what did they do with their royal dwarf children? They had three main options. The first option was to keep them in the palace. This sounds like it would be pretty sweet, but it came with one major caveat. If you were a royal dwarf, you would never, ever be allowed to leave the palace walls. Your life would consist of performing for the amusement of the king and his court. You would be paraded around, shown off like a prized possession. And if you were lucky, you would be given some fancy clothes and allowed to play with expensive toys. But make no mistake, your entire life would be dedicated to being a court fool. The second option was to hide them away in a remote estate or convent. This was done out of shame and secrecy, with the hope that nobody would ever find out about the child's existence. They would be raised in isolation, with little to no contact with the outside world. Oftentimes they were given false identities, so that even their own family members wouldn't know who they were. It was a sad and lonely existence, but it was also incredibly common. In fact, there are rumors that Henry VIII tried to hide at least one of his children away in this manner, though history is hazy on the details. The third option was to send them to a monastery, where they would be raised as monks or nuns, taking religious vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. This may seem like the best choice, but remember, they were still royal. As such, they were expected to live according to the standards of nobility. Even if they were now in a monastery, they were required to wear fine robes and live in luxury, which put them at odds with the actual values of the religious orders they were supposedly joining. Okay, now that we've got that out of the way, let's take a look at one of the most famous examples of a royal dwarf, the young prince. In painting Las Meninas, okay, maybe he's not the most famous example, but he's probably the most well documented. This painting shows the Spanish royal court with King Philip IV and his wife, Queen Mariana of Austria. But everyone's favorite dwarf is right there in the middle of it all. His name was Juan de Paria, and he was a fixture at the Spanish royal court for decades. He was a friend to the king, a confidant to the queen, and a constant presence in the royal family. He traveled with them everywhere and was present at every major royal event. He was also a painter, and his work was highly regarded at the time. He was considered a genius, and his paintings were displayed prominently in the royal palaces. But let's be real here, a dwarf painter doesn't exactly scream genius. More likely, he was a talented artist who just happened to be a dwarf. But because of the stigma surrounding dwarfism, it was easier for people to believe that he was actually a genius painter than to admit that a dwarf could be one. This brings us to the central question of this video: how were royal dwarfs treated? The answer is both fascinating and depressing. While it's true that some dwarves were treated relatively well, like Prince Juan, this was the exception rather than the norm. For the most part, royal dwarfs were treated like dirt. They were humiliated, belittled, and used for the amusement of the masses. One of the worst offenders was the Sun King, Louis XIV of France. He hosted lavish parties and balls where he would force dwarfs to perform for his amusement. He would dress them up in ridiculous costumes and force them to dance and sing while he and his courtiers laughed and jeered at them. He even went so far as to build a special theater where he would put on shows featuring dwarves and other performers with physical disabilities. It was called the Grand Spectacle of the Sun King, and it was here that the most infamous acts of humiliation took place. Another royal who delighted in humiliating dwarves was Peter the Great of Russia. He was a giant of a man, literally. He was over 6 feet tall, which was unheard of in his day. He used his size to intimidate and dominate those around him, including dwarfs. He would pick them up and throw them around like rag dolls, and he would force them to perform for his amusement. He even built a special garden in his palace where he would display dwarves like they were exotic plants. But it wasn't all just physical abuse. There was also psychological abuse. Many dwarfs were kept in isolation, cut off from the outside world. They were forced to live in their own waste, and they were denied basic necessities like food and water. Some dwarfs died as a result of this abuse, but it didn't stop Peter the Great from continuing his reign of terror. Now, before you go calling Peter the Great a monster, it's important to remember that this was the norm back then. The vast majority of dwarfs were treated horribly, and there were even entire institutions dedicated to their humiliation and torture. The Spanish Inquisition, for example, saw dwarfism as a sign of witchcraft, and they would often torture dwarfs in an effort to extract confessions from them. So what does this all mean for our understanding of history? What can we learn from the experiences of royal dwarfs? Well, for starters, it shows us that the past wasn't always as glamorous as it seems. People who lived in the past were not immune to the same prejudices and biases that we have today. In fact, they were often worse. But it also shows us that there were people in the past who were trying to make a difference. There were abolitionists who were fighting against slavery, scientists who were challenging the prevailing religious dogma, and artists who were pushing the boundaries of creativity. It's easy to get caught up in the negative aspects of history, but it's important to remember that there were always people who were trying to make the world a better place. It's also important to remember that history is written by the victors. Those with the power to shape the narrative often do so in a way that benefits them. This is why it's so important to listen to voices that have been marginalized or silenced in the past. When we do this, we gain a more complete and accurate understanding of history. We also begin to appreciate the humanity of those who lived in the past. They were not simply objects of ridicule or targets of abuse. They were real people with real feelings who lived real lives. So next time you think about royal dwarfs, I want you to remember their names. Remember their faces and remember their stories. They deserve it, and so does the truth. Thanks for watching. What do you think? What was the most shocking thing you learned about royal dwarfs? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. I'll see you next time.